Today, we're going to look at the basics of market research, some of the ways in which market research is performed. We'll look at some of the tools that are in use and also a bit about interpreting data. This can be a little bit contentious because not everybody, I suppose, necessarily wants to go deep into interpretation of data, particularly if you're a small business owner. And finally, we'll look at buyer personas and how the whole process of market research forms your buyer personas. So the basics, where do we start with when it comes to market research? Well, the first thing is to understand what it is, and that's to inform decision making for marketing strategies and business growth. At the end of the day, we use the data we get from market research to inform us to make better decisions about our businesses. Nothing particularly outstandingly complex about that. Just simply, we want to make better decisions, and we make that with data. But we need to gather that data from somewhere. We need to report on that data and then analyze that data in how it relates to marketing our products or marketing our services. And that's regardless of whether it's a business to business or a business to consumer business. It all comes from the same place. We need to gather data that helps us to better understand who our customer is and who they may be, what they might be doing and what their behaviors are like. Then reporting on that. So we get some feedback from it and go, yep, this is true. And then analyzing that data to make sure that it's got something meaningful in it. It's not just throwing out rubbish that doesn't really make much sense. It helps us to understand that there's a whole world out there, a bigger context than just what our goals are for our business. It understands that there are market trends that we have to take into consideration. There's things that happen beyond the walls of our business that we need to be aware of. There's also customer behaviors. Not everyone behaves the same. Not every demographic or age or gender or particular ethnic group will react the same when it comes to your product or your service. Not everyone needs it. In fact, you probably don't really want to serve everyone. Like it's very few customers that suit every single business that's out there. And then we also look at what the competitor landscape is like. What kind of context are you sitting in? Are you out on your own? Are you the only game in town, or are you up against several other people as well? It all forms part of this. And there's a very defined process that takes part as we explore what that market research looks like. The first thing we need to do is still define a problem. And the problem is we may not have data. That's as simple as is. We just don't know whether we're making the right decision about the product we want to stock, the location we want to be in, the kind of business we're looking to start up. Or if you're looking to go even further and start up a high growth venture, then is there a problem that customers actually need solved? Because if you don't have a customer, you don't really have a business. Once we move on from that, we look at developing a research plan. So we really just nut out, where do we get this information from? How are we going to proceed with that? Do we have a budget to spend on this? Do we have the energy or time to do this on our own? Or do we need to look at someone else to have a look at it? And then we collect the information. And collecting that information is really all about gathering all that data from all those different sources so we can then do the next part, which is analyzing that data. We look for patterns. We're looking for correlations. We're looking for something that tells us a story behind what that data means. Because data on its own could almost say anything. But when you look deeper into it, you spend some time analyzing it, you start to see patterns. You start to see things that are trends or tendencies that you can take action on, and which is the final step, is using all that data, using all that information you gathered to make decisions, to take the next step. So to locate yourself on the corner of those two streets, or to go online, or to only really make decisions about your marketing for that particular demographic of people. And all those actions will be very different depending on what your business is. Now, the types of market research we can look at, there's, and this is going deeper in the market research, probably what most of you are ever going to do, but it's good to be aware of what's out there. There's exploratory market research. That helps you to define problems and suggest theories. So you're just getting sort of trends. You're getting what seems to be happening out there in the marketplace. So you can go, okay, there's a gap here, there's a problem here, there's an opportunity here, and you can start to put forward some what we call hypotheses about this, which is basically just some ideas that are a little bit vague. We don't really know exactly what we're going to do, but we've got some vague ideas. The descriptive market research looks at variables such as, the potential that there is for different things, and those potentials could be everything from potential for growth, potential for failure, potential for success, or potential for specific kinds of people that we could expand our products into. So that descriptive stuff really gives us information that helps us to think, oh yeah, that's what we may need to look at further. But it never really stops there. It always comes to something else. Another kind is causal research, and this is all about testing theories about cause and effect, the link between something that's happened and what may cause it. And this is really a diagnostic thing that a lot of people will use. For instance, when they suddenly have a 20% drop in sales, they look for something to explain that, and they'll go through causal research. And that's causal research can be, getting feedback from customers. It could be going into much deeper things. I tell a story often about an activewear manufacturer and distributor based in Melbourne. Was it April 2020? They had a 20% drop in their clothing sales, and they were panicking and saying, "Why is this happening? And why is this happening?" And quite simply, 20% of the Australian population was now under lockdown in Melbourne. So that represented a good proportion of their customer base. You could only go jogging for 1 hour a day. You couldn't go outside. People didn't really want to buy many things because a lot of people were laid off from their jobs. That's going to have an effect in the market. So that was what we would call causal research. We're looking for a cause for that 20% drop. And it was an easy one to spot simply because, 20% of your market in Australia is locked down. That's probably going to have a very similar effect on your sales of a loss of, say, 20%. Predictive market research is about forecasting. We're looking at what today's patterns tell us that could lead to some decisions we'll make about tomorrow, or some potential directions that tomorrow can take. So we've got a bit of an idea about that. There's also two very different kinds of sources of research material. The first one being primary, which comes straight from the source. Now, this is examples, a survey that you've conducted. It could be data that you've got from your website, from your Facebook account. That's what we call primary data. The secondary data is based upon stuff that other people have already got. So you might get that from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or from Kaggle, which is a data sets that people use to test out, you know, machine learning and things like that. Kaggle is very useful for a lot of developers if they want to get basically a basic data set of openly available data to sort of practice with. After that, you've got things like, studies that are run by companies, by think tanks, anything that has statistics that you can draw from media releases. That's all based upon data that others have collected. Now, there's obviously some conflict over which one's better and which one's worse. Primary data is the best kind of stuff you can get, but naturally, if you can't reach a big audience of people with that feedback, if, for instance, you want to get some big decisions about your business, you cannot survey every single person in your town or city. Secondary data may provide you with some better insights simply because someone else has done the hard work, right? They've gone out there and asked questions, not the exact questions you would ask, but similar ones, things that might be sort of indicative of the kind of things you'd need to find out. Then there's qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative is where we're exploring research to understand the reasons and motivations for actions that people are taking. So if we've noticed that 20% drop in sales of activewear in Melbourne, we want to look at, okay, what are the reasons and motivations? We made an assumption that it's because of lockdown, but we needed to go and actually look deeply into that and go, let's run a Facebook campaign and ask people what they're doing right now. Is activewear something they get to? Is it something they want to spend money on? And the research we did in that particular case showed overwhelmingly that something like activewear was an extremely low priority on people's lists. Food, rent, power, phone bills, all those things, the survival stuff of life was absolutely what everyone was focusing on. The niceties of life, like decorations and new clothing and activewear, for instance, and gym memberships, they were not a priority to anybody. And so that sort of stuff just fell off people's radars. The quantitative research, though, is where we're looking for stats, numbers. So we want to quantify data and answer our research goals with real numbers. So that would be, we want to build a new road. We need those little measuring strips that the councils and Department of Main Roads will put on there. They'll use those to measure how many people are using the road. Do we need a new road? Is there something else we can do with this road? All that will give you is quantitative data. This many people over this period were using this road. And you could probably extrapolate out of that at these specific times of the day, the roads are getting used, but there's not many people using it at other times. So decisions would be made upon that quantitative data as to whether a new roads are required, or maybe it just means that, we need to do something else to encourage people to use alternative routes during peak hours because the traffic during non-peak hours is marginal or nominal at best. So why do we do this? Why do we bother with research at all? Well, it gives us a customer-centric approach to the decisions we're going to make. We're not just making a decision because of a hunch or some kind of, an instinct. We're not making it because of any assumptions. We're making it on pure hard data. We know that people want this thing, so therefore we feel much more confident in proceeding with it. It gives us a more informed decision-making process, and that is absolutely essential because most of us who get into business, whether it's a startup or a small business, we start sort of looking at these things and we have no idea what we're doing. We don't know whether we're making good decisions, bad decisions. This gives us at least a little bit of data to make a decision based upon, rather than just going, well, my sister said this and my cousin said this, and then you realize that your sister and your cousin have never owned a business in their life. That's not great data to work with. So you want to look at something a little bit better than the mob mentality. And then there's a competitive advantage, which is all pretty much about knowing who else is out there doing what you do and how they do it. Market research, yes, it might be helping you to make decisions about to set up a business, but if you don't know what the competitor landscape is like, you don't know what you're walking into. And that's a horrible position to be in if you're starting something new. So, how it's all done in this marketing research world is basically around tools that are digital, like SurveyMonkey. It's one of the most popular ones. It's kind of like MailChimp for email, but SurveyMonkey simplifies the process of sending out polls. Yeah, some of these polls could be as easy as things on LinkedIn. So, you've got a LinkedIn poll asking people a question. Now, a social media poll has one very big limitation. Yeah, it's usually only one answer out of 4 or 5 different options that you've got to work with. So you're not really getting deep insights. You're just getting a quick little decision making, black or white, red or blue. Yeah, it's very good at choosing between very small amounts of options for a definitive closed loop answer, but it's not qualitative. It's not giving you any sort of qualities or motivations or anything like that, unless you're specifically asking those things. Statista is a website that contains a lot of statistics. So you can go in there and find a lot of different statistics. Now, it's not 100% reliable. I've pulled out some stuff which have just been absolutely wrong in there, but it does give you some indication, particularly on global trends and national trends and use of big systems like social media platforms and search engines and web and phone usage. Those kind of things can be very, very useful, particularly breaking it up into demographics. It's a bit of an aggregator for lots of data coming in from lots of different places all around the world. You get a few free shots at that, but eventually they want you to pay for it, especially if you want to get some deeper insights into what those more qualitative answers are. Google has connections through to their it's like the webmaster tools, but it's more like a research tool. So if you just Google research tools, Google, and you'll be able to see what's available there. That's where I found Kaggle, which is that lots of data sets that people use usually when they're trying to test out systems and load in some dummy data to sort of test how their systems work. And big one for Australia is the Bureau, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, which is where all of our census data goes in. They often do a lot of other sort of ongoing longitudinal studies, so they do them over a longer period of time. They try to get a lot of depth of information from phone interviews. I used to be part of one where I got called every month for my update on consumer confidence, that kind of thing, and whether my spending is up or down or the same. And some other statistics you might be able to get are things like radio listening, TV watching, all those industries that self-monitor to see how they're doing and what people are watching or listening to. So digital tools then give way to what we call observational studies. And this is where you actually watch people what they're doing. We think the security cameras in stores are just to stop people from stealing, but often they're also watching customer behavior to learn how people move through a store. how people move from one section to another, whether they start off in a perfume section and immediately go to ladies' wear, or whether they go from the food section to the furniture section. These observational studies are often performed with people not knowing they're being watched, which sometimes raises a few ethical questions. But at the end of the day, you can perform an observational study by seeing who walks in your door. That will tell you in very limited way that over 6 weeks, I've had 80% of my clients come in being women and 20% of them being men. And that gives you a little bit to work with. Your vast majority of clients is women. But you can't then take that data and go, this is true for all people who do what I do, because you've got a very small sample. Over that 6 weeks, you may have only had 10 clients. So that's not a good sample size of people to base big theories and hypotheses on. So you have to get a lot of people in these observational studies. Then your competitive analysis side of it is basically performing a SWOT test, looking for your own strengths, your own weaknesses, your opportunities that exist, your threats, and then looking at the same thing in your competitors, asking what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their opportunities? And what are the things that are threats to their business as well? It's one thing to do it on yourself. It's another thing to do it on someone else. It really stretches your mind to step inside the shoes of your competitor. And that's where you'll start to find really solid information on how you should operate in the market. Not to crush the competitor, but to go, well, if they're already doing that and several others are doing that, why am I also trying to break into that? What have I got that's different that will get my own market share out of that? Data analysis software like Excel. So Excel, we think of it as a spreadsheet for calculating things, but it's actually really good for sorting data into different columns. Tableau and Microsoft Access, all these sort of database softwares. FileMaker Pro is very good for this as well. It's good at drawing connections between different pieces of data. So you can say something like, here's my column of gender, here's my column of age, here's my column of location. What things can I link together? Do I want to look at this based upon age and gender only, or do I want to look at gender and location only? You can use all sorts of software for this. Most of us just use Excel because it allows us to sort that data into meaningful connections. Things like Microsoft Access and Tableau are more of a database. They'll allow you, and Smartsheets is very good at this as well. It's very good at allowing you to find things that may seem disconnected. Another trick for you too is if you've got particularly the paid version of ChatGPT, you got the opportunity of taking that data and then asking it to analyze that data so you can see what things may or may not be connected or related or something like that. So let's look at interpreting data. And this is where things can get a little bit shady. Interpreting data, we do it simply because raw data on its own makes no sense. It's just dots on a page. It's just numbers down a column. It doesn't necessarily give us much to work with. But when we interpret data, we turn it into a story. The process usually is we clean up that data because there's always rubbish in there. We might even use a methodology that takes the extreme cases out and only uses the central things. So if people are only answering 1 or 10, then an average of 5 doesn't really give us a great idea of what the satisfaction levels of people are, because we've got one group of people who is extremely happy and another group that's incredibly unhappy. So that average of 5 doesn't mean anything. So sometimes we need to clean our data up a bit. How you do that will be completely up to you. It's completely up to you in terms of what your goals are and how big your data set is. When we look at processing that data, that's by taking that data, and by processing it, I mean trying to find different things that can connect. Process data might also say that there's some stuff in there that is rubbish, but most of it's not. So looking for the things that are useful pieces of data and things that are unuseful. Also there's a great move these days for data privacy, which means that sometimes there's personal details in that data that you should get rid of straight away. You don't need those necessarily. In some cases, if it's your customer data, then you may have a purpose for having identifiable information in there to know which specific customers do specific things. But in most cases, what you're doing is aggregating data from an average. So you're looking for, you don't need to know that it's Betty Jones from 12 Maple Lane. What you need to know is that there's a whole bunch of people of Betty's age that are behaving in a certain way, buying in a certain way, or want a certain kind of product. So you can make decisions about that. So once you process your data, you'll then analyze it. You're looking for patterns, you're looking for correlations, you're looking for things that stand out that maybe you didn't expect, or maybe they are things you did expect. But when you look for those patterns and correlations, you're looking for things that match. That we might see a pattern that on Tuesdays at 3 p.m., there is a great deal of sales activity going on your website. But at Wednesday at midnight, then there's only people putting things in carts and not checking out. Then you might look at correlations and you say, well, what I've noticed is that people who actually are logged in and have an account with the website buy 27% more on each checkout than people who are checking out as a guest. So those kind of correlations give you really good stuff to work with. You want more people to sign into your site because it leads to more sales, right? So it doesn't mean that necessarily the act of signing in causes that, but we do know there's a correlation between it. If more people log in, if people buy more when they log in, well, we want more people logging in, so they'll buy more, right? So that's the basic thing. What we want is really useful insights that lead us to make better decisions about our marketing strategies, and we get better results. That's all it really comes down to. We're using that data to do better. So, how do we then present that data to ourselves to make it really, really obvious to ourselves or to our stakeholders, to our business partners, to customers, to investors, all that kind of thing? Well, charts and graphs are pretty good at that. They tell a much better story than single words do or Excel spreadsheets. What you want is something that visually represents what you're doing. It could be in the form of a dashboard if you're using a tool like Google's Data Studio or whatever it happens to be called now. There's lots of different data visualization software out there. I think there's like Mighty Insights, I think, was one of them as well. Infographics are really good, particularly for public facing information that you want to get out there because they're very, very compelling. They've got a little bit of text, a lot of visual representation of that text that's in there, and it gives you a much more of a storytelling approach rather than just simple bar charts and pie charts that may look a little dry. Though, when it comes down to interpretation, things can get a little shady. We have a thing called confirmation bias. And quite often, if I really, 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 really want to work with this particular group of people, I will look for data that supports me. And I'll have this problem where I'll actually ignore the data that doesn't. I did this for many, many years when I was working on building websites. I really, really wanted to build websites for small businesses. But the reality is that small businesses don't want to pay much for websites. They also don't have as much of a need as a website, and those websites aren't particularly very good. So I had a confirmation bias where I was doing this market research, but I was always finding out, yes, I should still make these websites. But the reality was I was making very little money out of it, and it was a lot of work for very little reward. So the confirmation bias I had made me keep going with a business structure that just was not feasible. The overgeneralization of data, where you take a piece of information and you go, yes, that must be true for everyone, because I've seen 3 cases of data which has shown me that people over the age of 65 don't like using social media. So therefore, every person over 65 must hate social media. That is overgeneralization. That's just looking at a very small, cherry picking a piece of information and then telling a story about that, which is completely blown out. That's also what we call misuse of statistics, particularly if I ignore the 60% of the data that supports that older people really enjoy social media, but I picked out the 3 cases where people said they really hated it. That's a misuse of statistics. That's actually taking the stats. And whilst you're saying, yes, in these 3 cases, these people did say they hated social media, I've then ignored maybe 150 other people who absolutely love it. So that's misuse. Ignoring context is also looking at the fact that, like our mate in Melbourne who was selling activewear in the pandemic, he completely ignored the context he was in. He was actually in Melbourne. So he should have understood that straight away, but he ignored the context of which not only he lived in, but his customers lived in. And so it made him blind to the fact that he would lose 20% of sales simply because there was a pandemic on. There was a lockdown. People couldn't exercise as much. They weren't going through clothes as much, and they were worried about their lives, their jobs, their well-being. They were worried so much, and they looked at it and thought, well, you know, we're not going to buy as much stuff that we don't really need. So that ignoring context is so easy to do, where you'll start to spout out these stats and figures, and politicians do this a lot, and they leave out the context to which that was in. Particularly in American politics, they do a lot of this. So this all leads us to forming what we call buyer personas. Buyer personas at their very core are a fictional representation of who your ideal customer is based on. And it's based on the research you've done and real data about your customers. So you can quite clearly say that the average customer we have, based upon the 250 customers we've had in the last 2 years, is a 35-year-old woman, and we're going to call her Sharon because that just feels like it's easier for us to relate to. It's like you're painting a picture of an imaginary person who represents your average customer or your most common type of customer. Now, why do you need a buyer persona? This is all based upon helping you to understand and relate to that audience you have, or at least the audience you want to market your stuff to. So you've got a product, you've got a service, you want to market to them. Well, you need to understand who those people are. And quite often we say, oh, yes, a woman between the age of 25 and 39 with 1.5 kids, 2.3 Labradors, a mortgage, and an investment property. That's vague. It might sound really specific, but it's very vague to the human brain. We don't relate to that person, but what we do relate to is someone called Sharon. Sharon, who's 35 years old and has those attributes. We always remember about Sharon. Now, why do we do this? Why is it so important for us to have this persona? Simply because it allows us to focus our data collection around that person. It also helps us to segment our customers into those who are Sharon and those who are not Sharon. Because Sharon represents the vast majority of who your customers are, then you can separate your marketing efforts out into people who are very Sharon and people who are very not Sharon, because they're very different messages that may go out there. It also gives you a feedback loop. You can test things out knowing who Sharon is or who your persona is, and you get feedback based upon that. So you know, okay, our Sharon persona loves this particular thing because they've told us that and sales are up. Or our Sharon persona absolutely hates this new product we're stocking because they're not buying it all. And even when we discounted it, nobody wanted it. So that's how we know who our customer is, by just doing a bit of looking at our data. We look at who the most common kind of person is that pops up again and again and again, segment them out and say, this is our average customer, and understand that when you test things, you're doing that feedback loop. So what do we use to come up with Sharon, with our persona? We look at the demographics. It's an age group. It's a psychographic group. It's people who are either extroverted, introverted. They might be a particular Myers-Briggs person or have a specific DISC model profile. They may have certain behaviors. They'll have certain things that really grind their gears or things they need to solve. They might have goals in life that they want to achieve. And they'll also be reached through very different channels. Someone might be reached through LinkedIn like me, very easy to get me there, but then others might be reached more through TikTok. You wouldn't want to get the two mixed around, because, we need to know what Sharon would do. Where would a 35-year-old woman be mostly when it comes to the channels? She might be watching Married at First Sight. Well, we can't afford ads at that time of the night on television. It's too expensive. Can we afford to reach her through her LinkedIn profile? Well, she's not really looking to buy things through that, but when she's on, Instagram, on her Instagram channel, she may be more willing to see sales messages like that. So it helps us make better decisions. We use that persona to create better content to reach her or him or whoever our persona is, because we'll ask that question every time we go to create something. Will the person we're looking at value or see interest in this? Then it helps us to develop products. If we're going to bring in new ranges of products or build a new product at all, we need to ask, do they actually want or need this thing? And if the answer is no, then we go, well, why are we doing it? We're just taking a risk unnecessarily. Whereas if we know that elsewhere we've seen the Sharons of the world flocking to this particular product, then it's a pretty good idea for us to put it in place for us, because the Sharons that we are associated with are much more likely to see it. The personalized marketing side of it, that's where you're creating custom messages for that persona. So you wouldn't want to talk in skater boy talk when you're talking to a 35-year-old woman, right? It's a very different method of communication. It may look different, feel different, have different graphics, have a different kind of video or music behind it. That's personalizing your marketing towards whoever your particular persona is going to be. And then you're aligning your sales process with that. There's no point stocking a beautiful shop window in the middle of your local CBD only to find that your customer persona hates shopping in person and they want to buy everything online. So you match your sales process to the people who are in your persona. So our takeaways there. What, why, how, button, because? Well, the what is market research is a way of us making better decisions about our businesses. It's gathering data from elsewhere, and we do it because basically we want to make better decisions and get better results. The how is we're doing it through things from everything from a focus group through to surveys, through to getting data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But we've got to make sure that when we're interpreting that data, we're not just laying over our own biases over the top of it. So that we want to see a certain result. So therefore we'll color the data in to make it seem like it's saying something it not necessarily is, because ultimately we want to get better results for our businesses and we want to be able to grow our businesses. That's the whole reason we do market research.